I'm ready.
So welcome everyone to the program. My name is Mdu Ntuli, and today I am very, very excited to be speaking to Rehana Rossouw on her latest book, Predator Politics, which has been muchly publicized and muchly sought after and acclaimed because of the contents of the book and how riveting and sometimes how scary. As you read the book, I found myself at some point feeling very scared as a person, but also as a citizen of this country. So before I dive deeper into speaking to Rehana, for those of you who may not be aware of who she is, I'll just read a little bit about who she is. So she's been a journalist for 30 years, has a master's degree in creative writing from Wits University. Her first novel, What Will People Say?, won the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences Prize for Fiction in 2017. Her second novel, New Times, was longlisted for the Sunday Times Literary Awards in 2018. And of course, this is not a novel. It's a real story about what Fred Daniel has been going through for the past, let's say, 15 years or so, against Didi Mabuza and other politicians in the Great Land Scam. So I'll just very briefly read a little bit about what the book is about. So Rehana, you say on the back page, corruption cost taxpayers around 1.5 trillion rands during Jacob Zuma's spell as president of South Africa. Despite attempts by the police, the courts, and the public protector to stem the rising tide of graft, several politicians were rewarded with high office after stealing the aspirations of millions of people. Fred Daniel, one citizen among many targeted by predator politicians, stood up against the scourge. The retaliation he faced after attempts by corrupt politicians to grab his nature reserve in Mpumalanga included vandalism, arson, smears, and death threats. His nemesis is Deputy President Didi Mabuza, who presided over several departments in the province of Mpumalanga that were wrecked by graft before he ascended to the position of second most powerful politician in the country. Fred has won more than 20 cases over the past 15 years in magistrates and high courts where his claims of corruption-related harassment were found credible. The North Gauteng High Court was due to hear his damages claim against Mabuza, government departments and officials amounting to more than 1 billion rands, but the case has been postponed. It stems from Fred's exposure of fraudulent land scams in Mpumalanga. At great personal cost, Fred and his family stood up to corruption. They endured the loss of a livelihood and home and the fear that follows when the government places a target on the back of a citizen blowing the whistle on its misdeeds. Fred will not back down. For him, failure is not an option. Wow, that was a mouthful. So, you know, in the book, so I'll let you speak just now, Rehana. In the book, you say Fred Daniel is a South African businessman and environmentalist who is a whistleblower and a plaintiff in this case. But the trial again this year has been postponed. It was supposed to take place in July this year, 2020, but it has been postponed again. But for those people who may not be aware of this case or well-versed in this case, could you just tell us a little bit about how it developed and how Didi Mabuza is involved?
So yes, as you described, Fred is a businessman and an environmentalist. He made enough money when he ran an IT company in Johannesburg in the 1990s and decided to sell his company and to invest all of his money in a project where he felt he could teach people that nature has the ability to heal itself after it's, you know, even in areas which are devastated, like the land he found in southern Mpumalanga, where there had been asbestos mines and bad farming practices for decades. He bought a huge amount of land, more than 40,000 hectares. and had plans to develop part of it as a private nature reserve. And part of it he was keeping as a project where he would educate South Africans on the importance of climate change, on the importance of healing nature. And also on his land, he was going to teach people about the history of life on Earth, because the land he bought in Mpumalanga contains fossils dating back to the first ocean on Earth, to the first atmosphere on Earth, to the first living organisms on Earth. There's a lot of land that needs preserving. So he bought the land and started developing his private nature reserve. You have to work with the provincial government when you do such work, because they are in charge of conservation. He worked with the Parks Board in Mpumalanga. They cooperated with him for many years until Kerzner International, the hotel empire, came to see his land and decided to build 2 7-star private safari lodges on the land. And then suddenly the Mpumalanga officials stopped cooperating with him. They refused to give him permits to develop the land further. So that's Kerzner International could build the luxury lodges there. And in fact, they tried to persuade Kerzner International to rather work with Parks Board officials to develop land in the area. And that's where it all went wrong.
And so why did you choose to write a book for you personally about this story? What was it about Fred's story that connected with you as a person? And also, how did you then connect with Fred?
Fred approached my publisher, Bridget Impey at Jacana, for someone to write his book. He gave all the information about his 15 years of court cases against corruption in Mpumalanga. My publisher thought it was a good idea, and she approached me and asked me whether I was interested in writing the story. I connect with Fred because he is so anxious, and he has been so damaged by the corruption that he saw. I myself had suffered damage like that. I understand what it's like to be fighting all the time, where everything is a battle. I understand the fear that he lives with. I really do. No citizen should go through what Fred has gone through, not a single one. It's important to note also that when Fred first blew the whistle on corruption in Mpumalanga, it wasn't corruption involving his own project. It was corruption involving his neighbors who had been restituted their land, suddenly discovered that their community trust had been hijacked and that new land claims were being fraudulently considered in Mpumalanga, came to Fred for assistance, and Fred blew the whistle on a huge land scam that didn't involve his land. He's just a citizen blowing the whistle on corruption. And 15 years after he blew the whistle, he and his family are still in hiding. He and his family still being threatened. And he and his family can't get justice in the courts.
Yes, the case keeps being postponed time and time again. And then, Rehana, before this case, what was Fred's relationship with land? What was his personal relationship with land?
Oh, it's a long relationship and an important one. He had a teacher when he was in primary school who taught the class about the burden that Earth is facing, having to host so many humans and having to host humans who don't live in cooperation with land. He read a book when he was still a primary school student called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And Rachel had been investigating and reporting on the use of pesticides, particularly DDT, on agricultural projects in America. And there was one sentence in the book which really struck Fred as a child, and that he worries about still as an adult today. That on American farms, when spring arrives, there isn't a single bird. You don't hear bird song on the farms any longer because all the insects have been killed with pesticides, and there's no life to nourish bird life.
Wow. As I was reading the book, Fred's story is both fascinating and scary, as I mentioned. And then It is very scary. And then particularly for me, on page 47, which is at the end of chapter 6, there's a moment when the land claims against Fred's land are beginning to grow and they're beginning to be entertained. And even then you can feel the darkness approaching at that time. So I'll just read
Yes.
a little bit of what you write. So it's on page 47 and you say, at a meeting in March, the Parks Board's manager of wildlife protection, Jan Mueller, had given Fred the clear impression that his wildlife permit would be processed. Yet it was apparent that the board's attitude to him and Nkomazi had, for some reason, altered drastically and without explanation. The Regional Land Claims Commissioner had previously attested in writing, when Fred first took up an option on Msauli, that there were no land claims on the village. Yet claimants had since emerged and their claims were seemingly being entertained. Something fishy was going on. And also, before I let you answer, on page 77, which is chapter 7, you say corruption and fraud pervaded the Mpumalanga Tourism Parks Agency before, during, and after Didi Mabuza's short tenure of just over a year as MEC for Agriculture and Land Affairs, when he had oversight of its work and budget. So I just want to ask, is the dark world of corruption darker and deadlier than we realize? And when I say we, I mean us, the public, who rely on journalists and reporters to give us the information. Is it darker than we realize and darker than it's presented in this book?
Yes, it is. It actually is. I mean, at one stage, Mpumalanga had the dubious record of the biggest number of political assassinations in the country. ANC members who were blowing the whistle on corruption, for example, the building of a World Cup stadium in Mpumalanga, 2 senior ANC leaders in the province were assassinated after blowing the whistle on corruption. Mpumalanga has since been overtaken by KwaZulu-Natal in terms of numbers of people assassinated. But there was one time in Mpumalanga where blowing the whistle came with very serious repercussions and silenced people. The other thing also is I'm detailing 15 years of political corruption in Mpumalanga. There's nothing in my book that hasn't been reported on before by very brave journalists working in that province. But I think the act of pulling it all together and detailing all of it again as one story still managed to shock people. They may have heard about some of it 15 years ago. They definitely would have heard about it with the World Cup soccer stadium. That was such a big story. But detailing it all once again seems to have really shocked and surprised people when it was all in the public before.
Yes, and then also another example of this darkness, and one of the things that scared me as well, on page 88, in a phone conversation, Jan Mueller confesses to investigator Paul O'Sullivan, who was a forensic investigator of the Badplas land claims, saying, so I'll just read a little bit. He says, "My work is on the line. My career is on the line. My whole pension is on the line, and everything is on the line," he said in a phone conversation to O'Sullivan. "You know all the politicians involved in this stuff. I'm not going to name them, but it is a war. That I know. I think that Fred is the biggest war. I am quite worried, you know. They have tried to take me out a couple of times. I withdraw all my statements. I am klar. They will hang me. They will shoot me on the corner or let somebody drive a truck over me. You know this. You know how politicians work and how guys just disappear. I can assure you, I will be on their hit list. Yeah, I don't want to be on their hit list. I still want to live. I have seen what happens to people that turned against the government, especially in this province. They make people disappear, these guys." So that was quite scary. So how did you, is this not, this is new. A lot of people may not have heard this before. This is quite scary.
It is. So, look, we all know a lot of the details of the corruption in South Africa, and the Zondo Commission is doing a wonderful job of, showing us how exactly these schemes operated. I think what is interesting about Fred's story is the fact that so many government officials, so many public servants in the employ of government whose jobs are to make a better life for all citizens, don't do that. And it's not, I don't think we can say that every official is corrupt. Every official knows the consequences of not abiding by the instructions of their political principles. And I think that's an important story. We're hearing at the Zondo Commission from many officials who stood up to corruption, who faced retribution. It's not an easy thing to stand up. So Fred is bringing a damages court case against Didi Mabuza, but also against the government officials who implemented the corrupt instructions or the allegedly corrupt instructions.
Yes.
Or who stood in the way of progress.
Yes. Well, so Didi Mabuza, Deputy President Mabuza seems to be at the apex predator in this case and in this book as well. In fact, the former head of Department of Human Settlements in Mpumalanga, David Dube, characterizes him as, on page 168, as streetwise, cunning, sly, opportunistic, ready to grab the limelight, and a master manipulator. So that's quite a damning description. But is he the only one? Is he the only apex politician at that in this case or in this story? And I'm thinking about, in 2008 there was a cartoon created by Zapiro called "The Rape of Lady Justice," and in this cartoon, there's President Jacob Zuma, who seems to be about to rape Lady Justice, and then other politicians are holding her down. So that means he wasn't the only one corrupt.
Yes.
So are there other politicians helping Didi Mabuza in this case?
I think what I detail also in the book is that the corruption in Mpumalanga didn't start with Didi Mabuza. He was an early adopter of corruption when he was MEC for Education in the first democratic provincial government in Mpumalanga. He was caught red-handed inflating matric exam results for reasons that it seems he wanted to make himself look good as MEC for Education. So that fraud was committed and was easily discovered. And Didi Mabuza lost his position in the Mpumalanga government, but he was brought back. There've been so many people who became very, very senior leaders in the ANC who had been fingered for corruption in Mpumalanga, and instead of them, being prosecuted or perhaps, losing their jobs, this whole thing about the step-aside rule in the ANC, that you've been found guilty or you're being prosecuted for corruption, and perhaps, the ANC should say, you shouldn't be a leader at this stage in your career. And in Mpumalanga, a lot of people who were fingered for corruption in the first democratic government rose up to greater positions. That seems to be a problem, particularly in Mpumalanga.
And also, the front cover of the book is of the Deputy President. Would you need permission to use his photo in this publication?
No, he's a public figure. He is a public figure, and I don't need his permission. It's not a photo that he owns. The photo is in the public domain, and we have permission to use it. So no, we don't need it.
Oh, okay. I was wondering about that. And then I wonder if Fred and the president, the deputy president, have met and how many times. So I'll just read in the book on page 197, which is chapter 19. So Fred is talking. He said, "I was warned that when my name was mentioned to Mabuza, he became furious and vowed that when he was deputy president, he would ensure that the cradle of life was the first property to be expropriated." And then he also says, "I am still haunted by the events of 2008 and 2009 when Mabuza called me and refused to discuss the land claims, but said if I did not admit to them, he could not guarantee my life." So since that phone call, have they met?
They haven't formally met, but Fred first saw Didi Mabuza when a group of people were bussed in to protest outside his game reserve called Nkomazi Wilderness, to demand that the land be transferred to them, that they were land claimants and they were entitled to the land. It turned out none of them were land claimants. The people had torn down his fences. They were marching on a petrol station that Fred owned, and said they were going to petrol bomb it when Didi Mabuza arrived and stood on the back of a bakkie outside the gates of Fred's land and told the crowd to disperse. He promised them that they would get Fred's land, and they dispersed. There were two opportunities for meetings. One, while Didi Mabuza was MEC for land reform, Fred did not go because he was scared, because he'd been threatened with his life. He sent his lawyer to that meeting and a business partner, and they were, threatened at the meeting and had to leave. And there was a second opportunity when Didi was premier of Mpumalanga years later. And once again, Fred sent his lawyers. And the meeting, that time, Didi Mabuza refused to discuss the issues of these fake land claims, which have been conclusively proven to be fake. By the time Fred arrived in Mpumalanga in 1995, and when he started buying his land, all of the real land claims in the area had been dispensed with. People had been restituted their land. This new group of land claimants who were brought together by Didi Mabuza, who, while he was MEC, was running a parallel organization called the Greater Bud Plus Land Claims Committee. They arrived out of the blue. They weren't people who could properly prove their claims. They weren't people who could prove any historical ownership of any land in the area. Again, when Fred first blew the whistle, it wasn't because his own land was being threatened. It was because his neighbors' names were being fraudulently used for new land claims.
Wow. So since the case is not over yet, would this publication have any bearing on the case going forward? Since the trial hasn't taken place, it was supposed to take place this year in July, but it's been postponed once again. So would this book and its content have any bearing on the trial?
I hope not. I was very careful to write the book to include only facts, because a lot of the information in the book will be evidence in the court. Fred does have a new date now. The North Gauteng High Court has agreed that his damages claim will be heard in June next year. So, yes.
We'll see. We'll see. Yes, that remains to be seen.
That remains to be seen. Our senior politicians have a habit, which I think has been, they are all inspired by Jacob Zuma, where, you go to court and you get postponement after postponement after postponement, and the case is never heard. Fred has spent millions of his own rands in fighting for justice. He's not going to give up. At the moment, he's been represented by one advocate and one attorney. He doesn't have the big legal team that Didi Mabuza has, but he's determined. He's not going to back down.
So is Didi Mabuza using state funds to defend himself against these claims?
I don't think he will be able to. The North Gauteng High Court itself was the court that decided that Jacob Zuma could no longer use state funds to defend himself in corruption cases. So I don't think it's going to be possible. I really don't.
Okay. So now, Rehana, I want to talk about Bud Plus and the scam that was happening, because sometimes people become confused about how prices are inflated and who exactly is behind that and benefits. So in chapter 7, which you titled Blowing the House Down, you detail numerous facts about the land prices being inflated in the Bud Plus land scam, overseen by Ngeba Ngaba, who was then the Regional Land Claims Commissioner. So on page 62, you write, Mpumalanga Land Claims Commissioner Nceba Nqana reluctantly confirmed that he had ignored preemptive warnings from concerned local farmers and professional land valuators and spent 25.7 million rands on 6 farms in the Badplas district, which had originally been bought for a combined price of 4.3 million rands. This left speculators with a cool 21.3 million rands in profit. The prices on some of the sales, such as
Onverwacht.
Onverwacht farm represent prices, represent a 300% increase on their 2004 market value. So I just want to understand clearly. So was it the farmers who were inflating the prices, or was it the government officials who were inflating the prices, and then they'll buy it from the farmers and then they'll share the profits? So who was actually inflating the prices and who was benefiting from the rest of the profits?
This I found most fascinating, how all of these senior government officials were working with Afrikaner businessmen to defraud the government. The Afrikaner businessmen operated as middlemen. They would go to Pieter Versace, especially, who was a farmer in the area, who then decided that he was a property developer. And he would go to his neighbors and say, the Land Claims Commission is interested in buying your farm to restitute it to land claimants. Look, a lot of the white farmers in that area weren't opposed to selling their farms. They were no longer making profits. It was becoming very difficult to farm in the area because the land had been so degraded. So there was a willing buyer, willing seller in operation there. There was no need to use any inducives to get farmers to sell. But these white Afrikaans businessmen living in the area suddenly set themselves up as middlemen. So let's say they go to a farmer and the farm had been valued at 1.5 million rands in 1998. And I've got a lot of examples of this. They inflated the prices to up to 15 million rand. And the Land Claims Commission bought the farms on these inflated prices. No one was ever criminally prosecuted, but Nceba Nqana was found guilty in a disciplinary hearing and dismissed from his position as Land Claims Commissioner for having gotten himself involved in this massive inflation of prices. He had 50 million rand to spend. It was his budget. The government was buying farms for Black people who were interested in farming. And he decided that rather than use the money so that, not only could Black people get their land, but they could also be supported to work their land productively. Most of the money, the vast majority of the money, went to Afrikaner businessmen who then used those farms after they were restituted for themselves. So Fred's neighbors had a false land claim put in on their behalf. Land was bought for them, and white farmers were the people who were making money off the land. Like Fred's one neighbor got paid 7,000 rand rent a month for land that was restituted to his community, but a white businessman was then renting it out for 25,000 a month to McCain's to grow vegetables. White people suddenly, profited from land restitution funds that was aimed at Black people. So it's bizarre.
It's bizarre.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre that an ANC government could have supported white businessmen to such an extent.
Yes.
And what was also bizarre was a few months after Fred blew the whistle, and a few months after Nceba Nqana was suspended from his position, Thabo Mbeki, in his State of the Nation address, then starts talking about white farmers who are opposing land reform and starts talking about, maybe we should ditch the willing buyer, the willing seller, willing buyer strategy and go for sorry, what's the word?
Expropriation.
Expropriation.
Yes.
Expropriation, where there actually were enough farms in that area to restitute. It's shocking.
Was it incompetence? Was it a lack of investigation on the part of the government officials, or were they benefiting as well? It's quite bizarre. I'm trying to understand it. So was Neba Ngana benefiting as well, or was he just incompetent in doing his homework?
We don't know. We don't know. So what transpired after Fred blew the whistle on the scam was the National Department of Land Affairs had two investigations into the issue. One was conducted by Ernst & Young, and one was conducted by the South African Valuators Association. And they found that there had been collusion between the Land Claims Commission and white businessmen to inflate the prices of the land in Badplaas. Parliament was promised that there would be repercussions, but there were none. Not a single person has been prosecuted for defrauding the Land Claims Commission out of tens of millions of rands. And I don't understand it. I don't understand why.
Yeah, wow. That's scary as well, because I don't think it's over. I think it's something that's still continuing somehow.
Oh, no, it definitely is. The Special Investigating Unit produced a wonderful report late last year on corruption in the land claims process. KwaZulu-Natal is terrible. Apparently, a lot of officials have been giving themselves and their relatives land instead of restituting it to real claimants.
Wow. Okay, so I want to move on to the next question. Like, we're almost towards the end. So towards the end of the book, on page 30, which is chapter 21, so you write, Advocate Jacques Joubert told Judge Ledwaba that Fred was not obsessed with the damages claim, but had split the merits and damages issues so that the trial could focus on the merits alone. The damages could be adjudicated later. It was more important for his client to restore his reputation as an entrepreneur, Joubert said. If the trial succeeded in that respect, whether the court awarded 1 billion rands or 1 rand in damages, Fred would be satisfied. So what is his intention then for this case? I mean, it is ongoing. He has spent a lot of his own money. What is his deep intention in this case?
Exactly the way that Jacques describes it, to clear his name. He has been smeared by these people. They're still continuing to smear him. As after the book came out, they're still attempting to smear Fred. He wants to clear his name. So the North Gauteng High Court has now agreed that the case will be split. Yes. That in June next year, it will hear the merits of Fred's complaint, and that another court at some other date will decide on the quantum of the damages. Yes. Fred has to, because it is a damages case, Fred has to quantify it for the court. He has to explain what the damages are. So, 2 7-star Sun International hotels were going to be built on his land. That would have been a huge investment into a very poor area. So that's how, damages cases work. But the North Gauteng High Court has now agreed that come June, all they're going to be deciding is whether or not Fred is a victim of corruption-related victimization. He's been badly victimized.
Yes. So last year, December, Fred was diagnosed with PTSD because of all of this. How is he doing now?
2 years ago, he was diagnosed and he left in Mpumalanga. Yeah, and he left in Mpumalanga last year. He's now in hiding with his family. They are away from what he calls the firing line. Look, Fred's not the only one. Again, let me just say this. A lot of his neighbors were attacked as well. Everybody who stood up and said, something's wrong here, were attacked. There was a campaign of arson. There was a campaign of shootings. People's property was destroyed. Fred is now out of the firing line. He's no longer in Mpumalanga. He's able to, his poor child lost 2 years of schooling as a result of the victimization campaign. His poor child thought that, nasty people were coming to kill them. So it's probably a lot easier because he's no longer there. But it's also a lot more frustrating because he can't be there through no fault of his own. Through no fault of his own. He was a good citizen who stood up and said, look what's happening here. Government funds is being squandered. But he's the one who has to leave. He's the one who has to live in fear. It's frustrating.
It must be frustrating. And then lastly, Rehana, should we trust further reportings about Fred and his case? Because there's a very interesting case that you mentioned in the book. There's a journalist from Farmers Weekly who had been employed or corrupted into or bought somehow into reporting false claims about Fred. And then in the end, so this is on at the end of chapter 9 on page 75, you say he actually committed suicide. So let me just see where I can read. So the journalist contacted Fred soon after his dismissal to complain. Lou, and so that's the journalist. Lou said he had invested his pension in Visage's butchery in Nelspruit, and the cattle he received as payment for his defamatory Farmers Weekly articles grazed on the Ndwandwe Trust's land. He said that he was broke because Visage had slaughtered all his cattle and liquidated the butchery. He offered to meet with Spur to give him an affidavit about his dealings with Visage. On 30 November, Lou committed suicide by shooting himself in the head with an AK-47. Was he the only such journalist who was bought to report these false claims about Fred? And can we trust further journalists?
No, please don't trust other journalists. There have been a series of the most bizarre articles since the book was published in the Star, trying to smear Fred and trying to smear me. Stories that appear in the newspaper without a journalist's name on it, so you can't take any action against them, and complete and total lies, like utter lies published in the Star. I think Anton Harber's latest book, So for the Record, which looks at 3 stories that were published in the Sunday Times during a time of state capture, shows without any doubt that there were journalists who were bought. There were journalists who were part of the state capture operation. So I don't think, look, I would say trust most journalists. I don't think it would be fair to say that all journalists are corrupt and that all journalists are corruptible. I have one case of a journalist corrupted in Mpumalanga. There have been so many brave journalists in Mpumalanga who, despite attacks on themselves, like Sizwe Samayende of City Press, whose brakes were tampered with, shots were fired into his house. He's still reporting on corruption in Mpumalanga, and he's a brilliant journalist. There have been many, many brilliant journalists in Mpumalanga, and there are still many brilliant journalists in Mpumalanga.
Wow.
But in the politics of the smear, I mean, you have the politics of assassination, and you also have the politics of the smear. They attack on all fronts.
Yes. Wow. It's scary because now you have to think, can I trust when I'm reading a newspaper? Can I trust or not? It's quite scary now when I think about it.
You should get Anton Harber on your podcast. Have you read his book?
I haven't.
So for the record.
So for the record.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It really is.
Yes. Okay, I'll try and make that happen.
Yes, please don't tar all journalists with the same brush. We're not all like that.
Yes, that's
and
true.
And if you look at my book, I mean, in my book, I give credit to everybody.
Yes.
who uncovered corruption in Mpumalanga. It's not like I went out and uncovered this corruption myself. I could draw on so much of the work that had already been done by journalists in Mpumalanga, and I did. I did. There's nothing that's really new in my book about the corruption. Everything that's, Fred had gone through had been reported on already. Again, I just pulled it all together.
Yes.
And when you look at it all together, it seems like a lot for one
yes.
person to go through. But
yes.
Fred had support from many, many good journalists along the way.
Wow, Rehana. In closing, at the very beginning of the book, you put a quote by Tata Nelson Mandela. And so he's saying, our experience had made us acutely aware of the possible dangers of a government that is neither transparent nor accountable. To this end, our constitution contains several mechanisms to ensure that government will not be part of the problem, but part of the solution. He said this in 1996. Yes, and
He did.
and it seems, I don't know if his vision is crumbling, or if we have a beautiful constitution, but maybe the people who manage the constitution are able to find loopholes to get away with corruption.
Look, Tata Madiba did say that, and I do believe he meant it at the time, but he himself did so little to fight corruption. I was very struck when COVID arrived that Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma had been put in charge of the government's response. When Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was Minister of Health in Nelson Mandela's cabinet, there was a big scandal involving the mismanagement of AIDS funding. She had given a huge amount of money without a tender to Mbongeni Ngema to do a play called Sarafina 2. Madiba did nothing. He retained Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma in the cabinet. I must say one thing that really hurt me recently was the death of Kimi Makwetu. He was outgoing Auditor General at the time. Kimi Makwetu spoke out for years against corruption. Kimi Makwetu's quotes corruption in my book on corruption in Mpumalanga is so true and so scary. He basically says that at local government level in Mpumalanga, millions of rands were diverted away from services to the poor, to the ANC, to the political party. I find the Auditor General is often a fantastic resource to anybody who is investigating corruption. That 1.5 trillion rand figure comes from Kimi Makwetu as well. And the new Auditor General, I think, is going to be as brilliant as he is. We now have new rules where the Auditor General can now bring charges herself against corrupt politicians. They're no longer going to just write a report saying there was corruption. They're going to write a report saying there was corruption. This is the person responsible, and this is the police station where a charge has been laid. Maybe this will make a difference. Maybe we will start to see politicians going to jail for their corruption, because I find that the political impunity enjoyed by politicians in Mpumalanga and the political impunity that now exists in the office of the Deputy President of South Africa, the man who is a heartbeat away from becoming our next president, is shocking. It is shocking that so much has happened in Mpumalanga, so much has gone wrong in Mpumalanga, and yet, these Mpumalanga politicians keep on moving into the most senior positions in the ANC. Maybe now something will be done. Let's see.
Let's see. Wow. Yeah. So Rehana, so as I was reading the book, I did feel a lot of pain. I felt a very faint soreness inside, because I always think it's so sad that so many of our politicians don't have reverence for the positions that they hold and what it took to get them to those positions, and what it took for us to be as free as we are and to have the liberties that we have. so many people who suffered and sacrificed, men, women, children, for us to be here today. And 1994 really was an act of divine order. It was, but also it was through hard work and fight of so many people. So it's always very sad when you see politicians who, some of them are young and some of them were part of the struggle, but they don't have the reverence for what took place in this country to get us where we are today and to have the liberties that we have. So in closing, Rehana, I would like us to spend just 20 seconds in silence in respect of what took place in this country, and also to appreciate this case and what it actually means. Just 20 seconds in silence.
Can I just say one thing in response to what you've said, and I promise I'll be silent.
Yes.
What really hurts me is not the people who struggled for freedom, but the people who were entitled to freedom. Those people born after 1994. Why do we still have children drowning in pit latrines at schools in Mpumalanga? Why? The money has been made available to replace those school toilets with modern plumbing since 1994. When Didi Mabuza became premier of Mpumalanga, he said he would ensure that every school got modern plumbing. Why are children who were born free, who are entitled to a good life in South Africa, still drowning in toilets that collapse under them? And I'd like to have a minute of silence to think about those children.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you, Rehana.
Thank you, Mdu. I really enjoyed this interview.
Thank you. Predator Politics by Rehana Rossouw. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Thank you.